Hey, what's up guys? My name is Nicholas Corcel and you're watching The Literary Nomad. Today we're going to be talking about Cormac McCarthy and his unusual style and formatting that we see throughout his entire body of work. Chances are, if you ever picked up a Cormac McCarthy novel, you've opened it up and seen that it looks nothing like any other book you've ever encountered before, with the exception of maybe something by James Joyce, but you get the point. McCarthy completely rejects standardized formatting, dialogue, and punctuation. This abject hatred is very well documented. He even went on Oprah to profess this hatred, calling them little scribbles that blot up the page. In his own words, he said, "I mean, if you write properly, you shouldn't have to punctuate. I believe in periods, and capitals, and the occasional comma, and that's it." This has been an incredibly polarizing aspect of McCarthy's career. Some have lauded him as an innovative creator of a new form who really is just pushing the boundaries of what style and the novel can be, while others have said that he's just pretentious, over-intellectualizing his work, and making things unnecessarily inaccessible. And while I agree that his work is not the easiest to read and it requires a lot of legwork on behalf of the reader, I definitely don't find it to be needless. And if you examine the reasons why he's making the choices that he's making and you see his roots and the types of stories that he's trying to tell, you see that he's not just trying to dazzle you with style, but rather tell a story in its truest and most authentic way. We also see that he hasn't always written like this. If you look at his first two and only ever published short stories, they're much more conventional than his later work. And so you can see he started out as a normal author in the way that everybody else writes, and as he progressed through his career, he naturally stumbled upon this style that we see in his more popular books like Suttree, Blood Meridian, and The Road. And I think that that's a really important distinction to make. He didn't start out writing like this. He mastered the basics and then evolved past them. And I think that when you're going to break a standard convention of literature, that's typically a good way to go about doing it. You don't want to be 16, 17 trying to reinvent the wheel. Of course you could try that and maybe you'll be successful. But typically it makes the most sense to master the basics and then push past them. And again, doing this is an incredibly risky endeavor. When McCarthy first published this style, he had no idea if it would catch on, if people would like it, or if he would be widely rejected, criticized, and even made fun of for it. But he dared to take that risk and put himself on the line. He would rather take a shot at being a once-in-a-generation great writer than be just another really good writer. And I think that in order to achieve greatness in the way that he did, those are risks that you have to take. You can't toe the line and just do what everybody else is doing, or else you'll get those same results. In today's video, we're going to be taking a closer look at some examples of this atypical style and formatting of Cormac McCarthy, as well as exploring a few reasons why he does this and what he hopes and what he does achieve by doing it. The first major thing that writing in this style achieves is it emulates the oral and spoken word tradition that is really influential in the regions that McCarthy writes about, particularly in the American Southwest. You know, when we talk to each other and we tell stories, a lot of times we speak in fragments, we speak in run-ons. We don't speak in a perfectly eloquent manner. We don't talk like two Oxford students writing an essay back and forth to each other. No, we say things that don't make perfect sense. We speak disjointedly. I might say something to you that if I were to transcribe it word for word, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but you understand the meaning. And as the conversation continues to go and we kind of bat it back and forth with each other, it gets increasingly complex and convoluted, yet the through line of meaning remains. This becomes even more important in cultures where their traditions and histories have been passed down largely through oral-only means. And the American Southwest is absolutely full of cultures such as these, with an intense focus on oral traditions, with countless tribes of indigenous peoples, Spanish settlers, British colonials, and everything in between. Now we're going to dive into some dialogue and descriptions from The Road to kind of contextualize this emphasis on oral traditions and oral histories with the idea and concept of God that we see very, very, very prevalent throughout this book. We're going to be reading 3 examples, but they're all very short, so I'm just going to read them all in quick succession, and then we'll talk about it a bit. So our first example is, "Where men can't live, gods fare no better." Next we have, "There is no God, and we are his prophets." And then finally, and my favorite McCarthy line of all time, "He knew only that his child was his warrant. He said, if he is not the word of God, God never spoke." And really, you can track the entire progression of our characters from that novel in those 3 pieces of dialogue. It's really just a simple story about a man, his son, and their journey through the world and their journey through this grappling that maybe there is a God, maybe there isn't a God, but regardless, nothing is going to save them. And when we talk about how people pass down their histories orally, at their core, oral histories and oral traditions, and I guess you really could argue stories as a whole, are just people trying to make sense of and grapple with the point of life and kind of add context, or maybe not context, but at least explanation for this thing that we call life. And many indigenous cultures, this concept of God, and by God I mean God in the broadest possible way of meaning it, as the explanation of everything. And with the road almost being a rejection of God at times, because, they're living in this very bleak, very godless world, saying there are no gods and we are the prophets. So they're a prophet of this nothingness. The world has gone on, the world has ended, but it hasn't included them in that ending, right? They and all the other survivors are outsiders to this apocalypse that we don't know how or why it is formed. And so you can really imagine, right? Like, sit there and think about how might an indigenous tribe or an indigenous culture discuss the world ending and leaving them behind, right? There's no sun, the water is dusty and disgusting, the roads are endless and cracked and decaying, there's no food, you can't grow anything, there's really no animals. How might they speak about that? How might they characterize that in relationship to God? And Cormac McCarthy is just the highest degree of that. He does that at the absolute highest level. The second major thing that Cormac McCarthy is able to do through his complete and total rejection of modern form and conventions is really experiment and play with language in a way that is impossible to do if you're conforming to rigid rules. This allows him to not only be incredibly precise with what he's trying to say, there really is no gray area with McCarthy. He says exactly what he wants to and what he means to, and there is no bending with his prose. It's exactly what he wants it to be, and as the reader, we have to do the legwork and we have to adapt and figure it out, or we just don't read it. He doesn't care about making it easy on us, and that's why it really shines. One of my absolute favorite examples of this comes in Blood Meridian on page 71, where the characters and the prose switches into Spanish, and the description and the dialogue and everything else it's all blended together. The paragraph goes on, it switches to Spanish halfway through, then it breaks up into what we think might be dialogue, and it's left very unclear. And it's just one of these small and maybe even inconsequential upon a first reading paragraphs that you can just sit and spend 5 hours with, just looking at, examining, translating, contemplating. And honestly, that's really the entirety of Blood Meridian. You could spend a lifetime examining every sentence of the book and get new and more interesting insight with each time. So I'm not going to read the entire paragraph because it's pretty long and I don't want to just needlessly bog this video down. So I'm going to jump about halfway through the paragraph. It's at the bottom of page 71. The soldiers none spoke English, and they directed their charges with grunts or gestures. They were indifferently armed, and they were much afraid of the Indians. They rolled their tobacco in corn husks, and they sat by that fire in silence and listened to the night. Their talk, when they talked, was of witches or worse, and always they sought to parcel from the darkness some voice or cry from among the cries that was no right beast. La gente dice que el coyote es un brujo. Muchas veces el brujo es un coyote. Y los indios también. Muchas veces llaman como los coyotes. ¿Y qué es eso? Nada. Un tecolote, nada más. Quizás. When they rode through the gap in the mountains and looked down on the city, the sergeant of the expedition halted the horses and spoke to the man behind him, and he in turn dismounted and took rawhide thongs from his saddlebag and approached the prisoners and gestured for them to cross their wrists and hold them out, showing how with his own hands he tied them each in this manner, and then they rode on. For me, this paragraph is absolute literary perfection. McCarthy bleeds these two very conflicting ideas and people into one paragraph just perfectly seamlessly. He blends two languages together. It switches perfectly, and if you don't know Spanish, it gives you a certain meaning. You start to think, okay, is this the prisoners? Are they talking? Are they thinking? What is happening here? If you can speak Spanish. You understand what they say, so you're getting an additional aspect of meaning there. But both of these groups kind of are in interaction with each other, right? Like if I don't speak Spanish, I'm going to go and I'm going to Google, what does this all mean? If I do, then I'm going to, maybe, I won't have to look it up, but now I'm going to think, okay, why did he switch to Spanish here? You know, when most authors, they'll just throw some italics on it and call it good. McCarthy doesn't do that. He doesn't make it easy on you, and I think he should be commended for that. In conclusion, McCarthy is very clearly not for everybody. He's not an author that I would recommend to somebody who is new to reading or who isn't a big fan of literature. He's just not accessible. A lot of the criticisms of him do hold a bit of value and a bit of credibility. I mean, if he was one of the first authors I read, maybe I wouldn't be super into books as I am today. But I think once you get to a certain point and you really want to push yourself as a reader, you want to develop and you want to really grow intellectually as a reader or stylistically as a writer yourself, there is no better modern writer than Cormac McCarthy. He is inarguably one of the greatest writers to ever live, and the things that he did with form is truly unprecedented. The only person who belongs in the same stratosphere as him, form-wise, would be James Joyce. It's really Cormac McCarthy, James Joyce, a massive gap, and then everybody else. Needless to say, he's a writer that I'm really looking forward to reading more by this year. As of now, I've only read The Road and Blood Meridian, so I'm really excited to dive deeply into the rest of his oeuvre. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. My name is Nicholas Corcel, and I'll see you next time.